At dawn on a cold March morning in 1917, while Europe was still chewing through the First World War, a boy was born who would one day sit at the heart of British power, only to discover that the most dangerous battlefield isn't a trench or a cabinet room. It's the moment the country stops believing you. Reginald Maudling's story begins with a quiet, almost ordinary start, and ends with a ticking clock he could hear even when the room was silent. He arrived in Woodford, Essex, on 7th of March 1917, into a Britain that measured life in ration books, telegrams, and the long shadow of empire. His family was respectable, lower middle class, the kind of household where ambition was not announced with trumpets but built like a wall, brick by brick, exam by exam. The young Maudling learned early that the world rewarded the boy who could master words and numbers, who could stay calm while others panicked. That calm would become his signature. It would also become his trap. School was his first arena. He was clever, dangerously clever in a way that made teachers lean in and classmates keep their distance. He didn't just want to win. He wanted to understand the rules so completely that winning became inevitable. In the Britain between wars, that kind of mind had a clear route upward. Scholarships, elite education, the machinery of government. The country was full of brilliant young men being trained to run an empire that was already starting to crack. Then, history tightened its grip. The 1930s were not a gentle decade to come of age in. The air carried the metallic taste of crisis. Unemployment lines, political extremism, the sense that the old order was wobbling on its foundations. For a young man with Maudling's instincts, politics wasn't just a career, it was a control room. If the world was going to shake, he wanted his hands on the levers. He went to Oxford, Merton College, where the future rulers of Britain were being forged in tutorials and debates, in smoky rooms where arguments were sharpened like knives. Oxford didn't just teach him economics and policy, it taught him performance, how to sound certain even when the ground was moving, how to turn complexity into a sentence that could win a room. He absorbed the rhythms of establishment life, but he was never merely a decorative product of it. He was hungry. He wanted to matter. And then the Second World War arrived like a door kicked off its hinges. For many of his generation, war was the great interruption. For Maudling, it was also a brutal education. He served in the Royal Air Force, and the war years forced him to see government not as theory but as survival. Britain became a nation of improvisation. Ministries coordinating production, intelligence, logistics, morale. The state grew teeth. The old liberal assumptions, small government, slow change, were burned away by necessity. Maudling watched that transformation up close, and he learned something that would define him. In a crisis, the public doesn't care about ideology. They care about results. When the war ended, Britain was exhausted, victorious, and broke. The empire was still painted red on maps, but the paint was peeling. The Labour government under Clement Attlee built the welfare state, nationalized industries, and promised security from cradle to grave. For conservatives, it was a moment of existential confusion. How do you oppose a revolution that people are cheering for? How do you argue against hospitals and pensions without sounding like a villain? Maudling chose his side. He joined the Conservative Party, not as a nostalgic defender of the past, but as a modernizer who understood that the party had to adapt or die. He wasn't interested in romantic speeches about tradition. He was interested in power, and in the practical question of how to make a post-war Britain function. In 1950, he entered Parliament as the Conservative Member of Parliament for Barnet. He was only in his early 30s, but he carried himself like someone who had already rehearsed the job. The House of Commons was a theater with ancient rituals, and Maudling learned quickly how to use them. He spoke with a controlled confidence, the kind that made colleagues think, this man is safe in a storm. He wasn't the loudest voice, but he was the one people listened to when the noise died down. The Conservative Party returned to power in 1951. And Maudling's rise began to accelerate. He moved through junior roles, learning the internal geography of government. Who mattered? Who pretended to matter? Who could kill? A policy with a raised eyebrow. He became known as a man of brains and charm, someone who could make complicated issues sound manageable. In politics, that is a superpower. But even in these early years, the seeds of his central conflict were already planted. Maudling's gift was persuasion, his ability to smooth rough edges, to make hard choices sound painless. The danger of that gift is that you start believing your own soothing words. You start thinking you can talk your way out of anything. And in British public life, there is one unforgiving judge: credibility. Lose it, and the ground opens beneath you. By the mid-1950s, he was no longer just a promising backbencher. He was inside the machine. In 1955, he became economic secretary to the Treasury, stepping into the bloodstream of national policy. Britain's economy was a constant headache. Balance of payments, crises, inflation fears, the struggle to maintain living standards, while competing in a changing world. The Treasury was where dreams went to be interrogated. Maudling thrived there. He liked the numbers, the levers, the sense that a decision on paper could ripple through millions of lives. He developed a reputation as a one-nation conservative, pragmatic, centrist, willing to accept parts of the welfare state and focus on growth rather than ideological purity. This put him in a particular kind of fight. Not a dramatic duel with a single enemy, but a grinding struggle against the party's internal instincts. There were conservatives who wanted to roll back the post-war settlement, who saw compromise as surrender. Maudling saw compromise as survival. He wasn't trying to win arguments. He was trying to keep the country governable. In 1957, he became financial secretary to the Treasury, and the pressure increased. The British economy in those years could feel like a patient who looked fine until suddenly collapsing. A run on the pound, a spike in prices, a trade deficit, any of it could trigger panic. Ministers lived with the constant fear of a crisis that would arrive overnight, announced by headlines and market whispers. Maudling learned to operate under that fear, to keep his voice steady while the numbers screamed. Then came a role that would shape his public identity. In 1960, he became Paymaster General and then, in 1961, Minister of Supply. These were not glamorous posts, but they were crucial in a Britain still managing the aftershocks of war and the demands of modernization. Defense procurement, industrial capacity, the relationship between government and industry. This was the hidden architecture of national power. Maudling was building a portfolio of competence. He was becoming, in the eyes of many, a future leader. And leadership was the prize that hovered over him like a bright, dangerous star. The Conservative Party in the early 1960s was dominated by Harold Macmillan, a patrician figure who understood television, mood, and the art of reassurance. "You've never had it so good," Macmillan famously told the country. And for a while it seemed true. But beneath the surface, Britain was changing fast. Decolonization, youth culture, new expectations, old scandals. The government's authority could evaporate in a single news cycle. Maudling, with his modern image and economic expertise, looked like the kind of man who could inherit the future. He was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1962, one of the most powerful jobs in the country. Now, he wasn't just advising, he was steering. The Treasury was his cockpit, and Britain's economy was the aircraft, heavy, complex, and prone to sudden turbulence. As Chancellor, he pushed for growth. He wanted expansion, confidence, a sense of momentum. In a nation haunted by decline, growth was not just an economic goal. It was psychological warfare against pessimism. But growth came with risks. Inflation, balance of payments pressure, the ever-present vulnerability of sterling. Every decision carried a hidden timer. If the numbers turned, the markets would punish Britain without mercy. And here the clock begins to tick louder. Because Maudling's ambition was now colliding with the brutal reality of British economic limits. He could promise prosperity, but he couldn't command the world economy. He could stimulate demand, but he couldn't instantly modernize industry. He could project confidence, but he couldn't permanently silence the fear that Britain was slipping behind. In 1963, Macmillan's government was hit by the Profumo affair, a scandal that didn't just embarrass ministers, it corroded trust. The public saw not merely personal misconduct, but a ruling class that looked careless, entitled, out of touch. In that atmosphere, every senior conservative became a potential successor, and Maudling was suddenly not just a chancellor, but a contender. When Macmillan resigned later that year, the conservative leadership contest became a drama of factions and old-school selection methods. Maudling was in the mix, but the party chose Alec Douglas Home. It was a turning point that didn't look like one at first. Maudling remained important, but the crown had passed to someone else. In politics, missing your moment can be fatal. Not immediately, but slowly, like a crack spreading through glass. The Conservatives lost the 1964 general election to Labour under Harold Wilson. Maudling moved into opposition, carrying both the weight of his experience and the sting of what might have been. He was still young enough to dream of leadership, still prominent enough to be watched. But now he faced a different kind of enemy. Time. Politics is not kind to men who are next time. Next time can become never. In opposition, Maudling remained a central figure, shaping conservative economic thinking and presenting himself as a credible alternative to labor. He had the skills, the calm voice, the grasp of policy, the ability to make the complicated sound simple. Yet the party was changing. New ideological currents were forming, and the public mood was shifting. The 1960s were not just about economics. They were about identity, authority, and social transformation. The old consensus was fraying, and Maudling, so good at managing systems, was about to be tested by something far less manageable: the raw, unpredictable force of public perception. Because in British politics, competence is not enough. You must also look clean. You must look trustworthy. You must look like the future. And as Maudling stood on the edge of the next phase of his life, the stakes were sharpening into something personal. He had already climbed high. He had already tasted the air near the summit. Now the question was whether he could survive the climb without slipping, without the country deciding, in one sudden, irreversible moment, that the man who sounded so steady was no longer believable. The next act of his story would not be about learning how power works. It would be about what power does to you when the clock is running and the spotlight turns from your policies to your character. The cruelest thing about British politics is that it doesn't always kill you with a vote. Sometimes it kills you with a headline, one that turns your name into a punchline before you even realize you're bleeding. Reginald Maudling had spent years mastering the art of sounding unshakable. Now he was about to learn what happens when the ground decides to move anyway. By the mid-1960s, Maudling was one of the Conservative Party's most recognizable brains. Former chancellor, polished performer, the man who could talk about sterling and growth as if he were describing the weather. But the party he served was no longer the same creature that had carried him upward. The old patrician confidence had been cracked by scandal and defeat. And in opposition, the Conservatives were hungry. Hungry for a leader who could win. Hungry for a story that didn't smell like yesterday. Maudling wanted that leadership. He didn't always say it out loud, but it sat behind his eyes when he spoke. The sense that he had been built for the top job. Yet the clock was already ticking in a way he couldn't control. In British politics, there's an invisible expiry date on future leader. Miss your moment, and you don't just lose power. You lose the public's imagination. And Maudling had already watched one moment slip away in 1963. In 1965, the Conservatives chose Edward Heath as leader. Heath was not the smooth clubman type. He was modern, managerial, and determined to drag the party into a new era. For Maudling, it was another near miss. Another reminder that brilliance and charm didn't automatically translate into the crown. Still, he remained indispensable. Heath made him shadow chancellor, putting him back in the role that had once defined him. The man with the numbers. The man who could make an economic argument sound like common sense. But opposition is a strange kind of power. You can promise anything because you don't have to deliver it. You can sound confident because you don't have to sign the papers. Maudling, who had always believed in results over ideology, now had to fight on a different battlefield. Perception. Labor under Harold Wilson talked the language of modernization, of the white heat of technology. The Conservatives needed to look like the future too, not just the custodians of a fading empire. Maudling could do competent. Could he do new? Then, in 1970, the country turned. Against expectations, Heath won the general election. It was a shock to the political class. Polls and pundits had leaned the other way, and suddenly the Conservatives were back in office, with a mandate that felt like a door slammed open by surprise. For Maudling, it was a return to the center of the machine. He didn't get the treasury again. Instead, Heath gave him one of the most combustible jobs in government. Home Secretary. It was a post that could make a career, or end it. The Home Office is where politics stops being theory and becomes flesh. Crime, prisons, policing, immigration, public order. It's where you inherit problems that don't care about your speeches. And in 1970, Britain was not calm. The country was tense with industrial conflict, economic strain, and a growing sense that the old rules weren't working. But the real firestorm was across the Irish Sea. Northern Ireland was sliding into violence that would soon be known simply as the Troubles. Bombings, shootings, sectarian fear, streets where the air itself felt hostile. The British government was being pulled into a conflict that was both political and deeply personal for the people living it. As Home Secretary, Maudling was not a distant observer. He was one of the ministers who had to decide what the state would do when order collapsed. And here the time limit becomes brutally real. Every day without control meant more funerals, more rage, more recruits for extremism. There was no comfortable timetable, no slow committee process. Decisions had to be made under pressure, with incomplete information, while the public demanded certainty. In August 1971, the Northern Ireland government introduced internment without trial, arresting suspected militants and holding them without due process. It was meant to crush the IRA. Instead, it poured petrol on the fire. The images were stark. Men dragged from homes, families screaming, communities convinced the state had chosen sides. Violence escalated. Trust evaporated. And in London, ministers were forced to defend policies that looked, to many, like the abandonment of basic justice. Maudling, with his instinct for reassurance, tried to project control. He spoke in the measured tones of a man who believed the state could manage anything if it kept its nerve. But the conflict didn't respond to calm voices. It responded to anger, to grief, to retaliation. Then came January 1972, and with it a day that would stain the British state for generations. Bloody Sunday. In Derry, during a civil rights march, British soldiers shot and killed unarmed civilians. The news hit like a physical blow. Photographs, eyewitness accounts, the raw horror of people dying in the street. This wasn't an abstract policy debate. It was blood on television screens. Maudling went to the House of Commons and defended the Army's account. He told Parliament that the soldiers had fired at gunmen and bombers. In that moment, he was doing what governments often do in crisis, closing ranks, trying to hold the line, trying to prevent the entire structure from collapsing under outrage. But the cost of that instinct was enormous, because if the official story was wrong, if the state had lied, or even simply rushed to judgment, then the Home Secretary's credibility would be shredded. And credibility, for Maudling, was everything. He had built his entire political identity on being the steady man, the safe pair of hands. Now he was tied to a narrative that many people, especially in Ireland, believed was a cover-up. The conflict wasn't just in Belfast and Derry anymore. It was in the moral authority of the British government itself. The violence intensified. Bombs reached the British mainland. Fear became part of ordinary life. The Home Office faced the nightmare of modern terrorism. Attacks designed not just to kill, but to send a message that nowhere was safe. Maudling's job was to protect the public, but also to protect the state from becoming something unrecognizable in its desperation. And while Northern Ireland burned, another fuse was quietly hissing in London, one that had nothing to do with sectarian conflict and everything to do with the oldest poison in politics: money and influence. Maudling had long moved in the world where business and government touched. In Britain, that contact zone was always dangerous. Dinners, introductions, favors that could be described as networking or corruption, depending on who was telling the story. In 1972, questions began to swirl around his relationship with a businessman named John Polson, an architect and property developer, who had built a web of bribery and influence. Polson's empire wasn't made of concrete alone. It was made of envelopes, hospitality, and the quiet assumption that the right connections could open any door. When Polson's world started to collapse under investigation, it didn't just expose him. It exposed the people who had benefited from his generosity, and Maudling's name was in the air. The allegations were not that Maudling had taken a direct bribe in the crude, cinematic sense. The danger was subtler, and in some ways, more lethal. That he had accepted hospitality and financial arrangements that made him look compromised. In politics, the appearance of corruption can be as fatal as corruption itself. The public doesn't read footnotes. They read the feeling. The press began to circle. Questions were asked in Parliament. The story grew teeth. And Maudling, already carrying the weight of Northern Ireland, now faced a second front. The possibility that his personal judgment, his sense of what was acceptable, was flawed. This was the real conflict of his life made visible. Maudling versus credibility. Not Maudling versus labor, not Maudling versus the economy, but Maudling versus the public's belief that he was clean enough to be trusted with power. He had always believed he could manage perception with calm explanations. But scandal doesn't negotiate. It spreads. In 1972, Heath removed him as Home Secretary. Officially, it was a reshuffle. Politically, it felt like a demotion under a cloud. Maudling was moved to a less central role, Secretary of State for Employment, at a time when industrial relations were themselves a battlefield. Strikes, wage disputes, the government's attempt to control inflation through policy that unions resisted. It was a job where every decision could trigger chaos, but the Polson affair didn't fade. It deepened. In 1973, a parliamentary inquiry examined Maudling's conduct. The committee criticized him for accepting benefits and for what it saw as a serious error of judgment. The language was devastating in its restraint. British official condemnation is often delivered like a polite knife. It didn't have to call him corrupt to make him look tainted. It simply had to suggest that he had failed the standard expected of a senior minister. And once that suggestion is planted, it grows. Maudling resigned from the government in July 1973. The resignation wasn't just the end of a job, it was the collapse of a trajectory. The man who had once looked like a potential prime minister was now leaving office under the shadow of scandal, at the very moment. When Britain was entering one of its most turbulent decades, the timing was merciless. The Heath government was struggling with the miners, with inflation, with the oil crisis that would soon slam into the economy like a wave of cold water. The country was heading toward the three-day week, toward power cuts and candlelit evenings that felt like a national humiliation. In such a moment, a politician with Maudling's economic experience might have been invaluable. But politics is not a meritocracy of usefulness. It is a theater of trust. And Maudling's trust had been punctured. He tried to defend himself, to explain that he had not acted dishonestly, that he had not sold decisions. But the public mood had shifted. The early 1970s were a time when faith in institutions was weakening, when people were increasingly willing to believe that the system was rigged for insiders. Maudling, with his Oxford polish and establishment ease, looked like exactly the kind of insider the country was starting to resent. And there was another, quieter timer running. His own health and stamina. The strain of high office, the pressure of crisis, the corrosive drip of scandal. These things don't just damage careers, they damage bodies. The man who had always sounded calm was now living inside a storm that never fully stopped. By the time the Conservatives lost power in 1974, Maudling was no longer at the center of events. He remained an MP, still capable of sharp analysis, still able to speak with that old authority. But the spell had been broken. In politics, once you've been forced out under suspicion, you don't return to the top by simply waiting. The party moves on. The public moves on. And the story that remains attached to you is not the one you wanted. Yet Maudling's fall wasn't a single dramatic explosion. It was a slow, grinding unraveling. One crisis layered on another, until the weight became impossible to carry. Northern Ireland had tested the state's moral authority. Polson had tested Maudling's personal judgment. Together, they created a trap. Every time he tried to sound reassuring, it sounded like evasion. Every time he tried to sound firm, it sounded like arrogance. And somewhere inside that trap, the old ambition, the dream of leadership, was suffocating. Not because he stopped wanting it, but because the country had stopped imagining him there. The next phase of his life would be stranger and, in its own way, more brutal. A former giant of government trying to live with the echo of power, trying to rebuild a reputation in a Britain that was becoming harsher, more cynical, and less forgiving by the year. The clock that had once measured his rise now measured something else. The narrowing space left for redemption. Picture this. One day you're the man who signs the orders, briefs the prime minister, and speaks for the state in a crisis. The next, you're watching your own name turn into a warning label. Proof that in Westminster, power doesn't always end with a defeat. Sometimes it ends with a stain that won't wash out. When Reginald Maudling walked out of government in July 1973, he didn't just lose a ministerial post. He lost the one thing he'd always traded in more than ideology: credibility. And in the Britain of the mid-1970s, angry, exhausted, suspicious of the establishment, credibility wasn't a nice accessory. It was oxygen. Without it, even the cleverest man in the room starts to suffocate. He stayed in Parliament. Of course he did. Maudling had been elected young, had lived his adult life inside the rhythms of the House of Commons, and he wasn't built to vanish quietly. But the atmosphere around him had changed. Before, colleagues had leaned in when he spoke, because he sounded like the future. Now they listened the way people listen to a man describing a shipwreck he helped steer. With fascination, with discomfort, and with the unspoken question of whether he'd learned anything at all. The country was sliding into a kind of national emergency that didn't announce itself with sirens but with darkness. The three-day week, power cuts, factories idling, inflation chewing through wages like acid. Britain felt smaller, poorer, and angrier by the month. And Maudling, once the smooth voice of economic confidence, was now on the back benches, watching the crisis he'd been trained for unfold without him. That was the first twist of his exile. He was still useful, still informed, still capable of diagnosing what was going wrong. But usefulness isn't the same as trust. The Polson affair had left him with a permanent asterisk. He could speak, but every sentence arrived with a shadow attached. Yes, but can we believe you? And then came the second twist. More personal, more humiliating. Because the fall from office doesn't just take away your authority, it takes away your income. Ministers have salaries, staff, cars, the invisible scaffolding that makes their lives run. A backbench MP has far less. Maudling had never been a rich man in the aristocratic sense. He'd lived well, yes, but largely on the assumption that his career would keep rising. Now, with the top of the ladder kicked away, he faced a problem that many politicians quietly face and rarely admit. How do you maintain the life you've built when the job that paid for it is gone? So he did what disgraced politicians often do when the doors of high office close. He went to the world outside, business, media, VR, places where a famous name still has value even when it's damaged. He took on roles that brought money and visibility. He wrote, he broadcast, he became, in effect, a public commentator on the very system that had chewed him up. And here's the cruel irony. Maudling was good at it. He had always been good at explaining complicated things in a way that sounded effortless. On television and radio, he could still summon that old Maudling charm. The warm, slightly amused intelligence, the sense that he was letting you in on how the machine really worked. For an audience tired of slogans, that was intoxicating. But the clock was still running, and it wasn't a political clock anymore. It was a biological one. The strain of his years in office, the pressure of scandal, the constant public scrutiny, none of it had made him healthier, and Maudling had another enemy that didn't care about parliamentary procedure. Alcohol. It wasn't a secret that he drank. In Westminster, heavy drinking was practically part of the furniture, a tradition disguised as camaraderie. But for Maudling, it became more than a habit. It became a refuge, and refuges can turn into traps. The more his reputation narrowed, the more he leaned on the things that made him feel normal. Late nights, clubland comfort, the old routines of a political class that still treated him as one of their own, even when the public didn't. The problem was that the public was watching now with a colder eye. Britain in the 1970s was losing patience with the idea that powerful men could make errors of judgment and then simply carry on, smiling through it. He tried to fight back in the only way he knew, by being present, by speaking, by staying in the Commons, by refusing to become a ghost. But the Commons can be a brutal place for a man whose story has already been written by others. Every appearance becomes a reminder. Every contribution is measured not just against its content, but against the question, is this the same man who once defended the state on Bloody Sunday? Is this the same man criticized for taking benefits from a corrupt network? The past doesn't stay in the past when your name is the headlines. And yet, Maudling wasn't finished surprising people. In 1974, after Heath's defeat and the Conservative Party's internal turmoil, there was a brief moment when old hierarchies wobbled. The party was searching for direction. And in that kind of uncertainty, even damaged figures can look tempting, because they represent experience. Maudling still had friends. He still had admirers. He still had that rare ability to sound like a grown-up in a room full of slogans. But the era was changing. The Conservatives were about to be remade by a different kind of force. Sharper, more ideological, less forgiving. The party that had once prized Maudling's pragmatism was moving toward a politics that demanded purity and discipline. In that new world, a man with a scandal and a reputation for indulgence wasn't just risky. He was symbolic of what needed to be purged. So Maudling's route back to the center didn't open. It narrowed. He remained MP for Barnet, still working, still turning up, still speaking with flashes of the old authority. But the emotional geography of his life had shifted. He was no longer a man climbing. He was a man managing decline, trying to keep dignity while the story of his career was increasingly told as a cautionary tale. And then, in 1976, he made a decision that looked on the surface like a simple career move, but in reality was a kind of surrender. He accepted the chairmanship of the British Broadcasting Corporation. The BBC was not a consolation prize. It was one of the most powerful cultural institutions in the country, a place where influence could be exercised without the daily blood sport of Parliament. For Maudling, it offered something he desperately needed, a role that sounded respectable, statesmanlike, almost redemptive. But the BBC in the mid-1970s was a battlefield too. This was a time when the corporation was under political attack from multiple directions. accused of bias, accused of elitism, accused of being out of touch. It was also a time of industrial unrest inside the BBC itself, with unions and management clashing. And beyond that, the country was wrestling with questions about national identity, about decline, about whether Britain still knew what it was. The BBC didn't just report those arguments, it embodied them. Maudling walked into that storm carrying his own baggage. To some, his appointment looked like the establishment looking after its own. A fallen minister given a prestigious seat. To others, it was proof that the old network still worked, that consequences were negotiable if you had the right accent and the right friends. And yet, once again, he proved he could do the job. He chaired meetings, navigated disputes, tried to steady the institution. He wasn't a visionary broadcaster, but he was a seasoned operator, someone who understood committees, pressure, and the art of keeping a complicated machine running. Still, the time limit tightened. Because while Maudling was trying to rebuild a public role, his health was deteriorating. The late nights and the drinking weren't just gossip anymore. They were visible in the way he looked, in the way he moved, in the sense that the man's body was carrying a weight his voice tried to deny. The tragedy of Maudling is that he had always been a man who could talk his way through a crisis, who could make danger sound manageable. But you can't negotiate with your own organs. You can't charm your way out of physical collapse. In 1977, he resigned as BBC chairman. Officially, it was for health reasons. Unofficially, everyone understood what that meant. The clock had run down to the final minutes. He returned again to the role of commentator and elder figure, appearing, writing, speaking when he could. And there was something haunting about it. Here was a man who had once been at the heart of government during one of Britain's most violent and morally complex crises, now reduced to a voice on the margins, watching the country continue to fracture without him. The late 1970s were not kind to nostalgia. Britain was heading toward another political earthquake. The old consensus was dying. A new kind of politics was coming. Harder, more confrontational, less interested in the soothing pragmatism Maudling had represented. In that sense, his decline wasn't just personal, it was historical. He belonged to a style of governance that was being replaced in real time. And then, on 14th of February 1979, Valentine's Day, of all dates, a day associated with warmth and affection, Reginald Maudling died. He was 61. Not old, not ancient, just used up. His death landed in a Britain on the edge of transformation. Within months, the country would elect Margaret Thatcher and begin a new era that would make Maudling's political world feel like a distant civilization. That timing sharpened the poignancy. He didn't just leave office before the storm. He died before the new weather arrived. So what is Maudling's legacy, when you strip away the caricature and the scandal? It's the portrait of a man who had the intellect and the temperament to be prime minister in a calmer age, and who instead became a symbol of how quickly a career can be undone when judgment fails at the worst possible moment. He was not a cartoon villain. He was not a simple victim. He was something more unsettling. A talented, pragmatic operator who believed he could manage any crisis until he met the two forces that don't care about talent, public trust and time. And if you want the final, sharp image to hold on to, make it this. Maudling spent his life trying to sound like the steady hand on the wheel. But in the end, the story people remembered wasn't the steadiness. It was the moment the wheel slipped, and the long, quiet aftermath of a man trying to live with the skid marks. Imagine surviving riots, cabinet wars, and the kind of scandal that can erase a career overnight, only to be handed a second chance at national power, then losing it to something as ordinary, as human, and as unstoppable as your own body. Reginald Maudling didn't run out of ambition. He ran out of time. After the resignation in 1973, he tried to do what fallen ministers always swear they'll do. Keep working, keep showing up, keep proving. They're more than the headline. He stayed the Member of Parliament for Barnet, still quick with figures, still able to slice through a muddle with one dry sentence. But the House of Commons is a place that remembers. It remembers the way you rose, and it remembers the way you fell. Every time Maudling stood to speak, there was an invisible footnote hanging in the air. Polson, favor, judgment, trust. And Britain in the mid-1970s was not in a forgiving mood. The country was living through a slow-motion emergency. Inflation that made pay packets feel like melting ice, strikes that turned routine into chaos, power cuts that literally darkened streets and living rooms. The old post-war confidence was draining away. People wanted someone to blame. and the establishment was an easy target. Men in suits who always seemed to land on their feet. Maudling, once the smooth voice of competence, now looked to many like proof that the system protected its own. Here's the part that stings. He still had the skills that had made him dangerous in the first place. He could still explain the economy without sounding like he was reading a manual. He could still make complicated policy feel like common sense. And outside Parliament, those skills were worth money. So he did what many ex-ministers do when the ministerial salary and the machinery of office vanish. He stepped into broadcasting, writing, and paid work that traded on his name and experience. For a while, it worked. On television and radio, Maudling could still summon that old charm. Warm, amused, the tone of a man who knows how the engine works under the bonnet. Viewers who were tired of slogans found him oddly comforting. He sounded like the grown-up in the room. But the comfort came with a cost. The more he lived outside the discipline of office, the more his private habits mattered. Westminster had always been soaked in drink. Late nights, clubs, the ritual of one more that turns into a lifestyle. For Maudling, alcohol wasn't just social, it was shelter. And shelter can become a cage without you noticing the door has locked. Then came the unexpected turn that looked, to some, like redemption. In 1976, Maudling was appointed chairman of the BBC, not a minor post, not a ceremonial bauble. The BBC was one of the most powerful institutions in Britain, an organization that didn't merely report the national argument but often became the stage it was fought on. And the mid-1970s BBC was under siege, accused by politicians of bias, attacked by parts of the press as elitist, pressured by government, and riven by industrial disputes inside its own walls. It was a battlefield with microphones. To critics, Maudling's appointment looked like the old network taking care of one of its own. An establishment man cushioned after disgrace. To supporters, it looked like a practical choice. Whatever his past, he understood pressure, committees, and the brutal art of keeping a complex machine running. And in the chair, he did what he had always done best. He managed. He steadied. He listened, negotiated, pushed, soothed. He wasn't a romantic about broadcasting. He was an operator. Meetings were chaired, crises contained, compromises stitched together. For a moment, it seemed like he might rebuild a public identity that wasn't defined by scandal. Less politician, more statesman. But the deadline was already inside him. The strain of years in high office, the humiliation of public disgrace, the relentless pace of public life, none of it had left him stronger. And the drinking, once a private weakness, began to show itself in the only way that can't be spun. In the body. The face changes. The energy thins. The voice can still sound confident, but the man behind it starts to look as if he's carrying a weight he can't put down. Maudling had spent his career believing that crises could be managed. By intelligence, by negotiation, by the right tone at the right moment. He had talked Britain through fear and uncertainty from the front benches. But there is one opponent you can't out-argue, can't charm, can't outmaneuver. Biology doesn't care about your resume. In 1977, he resigned as BBC chairman, officially for health reasons. Everyone understood what that meant. The second chance had been real, but it had been brief. The clock had tightened, and now it was dictating the schedule. After that, he drifted back into the role of commentator and elder figure, appearing when he could, writing when he had the strength. Still interested in politics, still capable of sharp insight, yet there was something haunting about it. A man who had once been at the center of government during one of Britain's most morally complex and violent periods now watching the country lurch toward another upheaval from the sidelines. Because the late 1970s weren't just another rough patch. They were the end of an era. The old post-war consensus, the cautious pragmatism Maudling had embodied, was dying. A harder politics was coming, less patient with compromise, more hungry for confrontation. The ground was shifting under Britain, and under the Conservative Party too. The kind of figure Maudling had been, clubland, committee rooms, quiet deals, was starting to look like a relic. And then the final irony arrived with almost cruel symbolism. On 14th of February 1979, Valentine's Day, a date associated with warmth and affection, Reginald Maudling died. He was 61, not an old man, not someone who had reached a natural political sunset. Just worn down, used up. A career that had once seemed built for the very top ended not with a grand finale, but with a quiet stop. His death came as Britain stood on the edge of transformation. Within months, Margaret Thatcher would win power and begin remaking the country in a way that would make Maudling's political world feel like a different civilization. He didn't live to see the new weather fully arrive. In a strange way, that timing sealed his story. He belonged to the Britain that was ending. So what do you do with a legacy like this? One that refuses to sit neatly in a box marked hero or villain. If you strip away the caricature, Maudling remains one of the most gifted conservative politicians of his generation. Intellectually formidable, economically literate, instinctively pragmatic, and, at his best, capable of making government sound like a rational craft rather than a tribal war. In another timeline, with one different decision, one avoided association, one moment of better judgment, he might have been prime minister. But history doesn't grade on potential, it grades on trust. The Polson affair didn't just damage Maudling, it changed the way people looked at men like him. It fed a growing belief that power operated by private networks, that consequences were optional, that the rules were different at the top. And once that belief takes hold, it doesn't matter how clever you are. Every achievement is questioned. Every explanation sounds like an excuse. And yet, the most unsettling part of Maudling's story is how recognizable it is. This isn't the tale of a monster. It's the tale of a talented man who believed he could manage everything. His career, his image, his appetites, his stress, until he discovered the two forces that don't negotiate, public trust and time. If you want the final image, make it sharp enough to sting. Picture him at the height of power, confident, composed, the steady hand on the wheel. Now cut to the last years. Still articulate, still present, but moving more slowly, the body betraying the voice, the second chance slipping away day by day. He spent his life trying to sound like stability itself. But what Britain remembered most wasn't the steadiness. It was the moment the wheel slipped, and the long, human struggle of a man trying to keep driving while the road, the country, and his own time ran out.